just gonna close it up. Okay. So good afternoon already, almost, and welcome to the second bioethics seminar. But I don't think they can hear right now. Wait, because it was still muted. Yes. Okay. Welcome everyone to the second lecture of the Bioethics Seminar Series. I'm very happy to introduce you all to my former colleague, Andrew Barnhart, who is a research fellow now at the Department of Ethics in the Faculty of Protestant Theology at the University of Bonn in Germany. He's a researcher associated with the ERC SimTwin project led by Professor Dr. Matthias Braun. Previously, he was a Marie Curie research fellow and doctoral researcher at our center here in Leuven, but he has now moved to Germany, and he focused previously on exploring the various ethical issues and considerations of organoid models in biomedical research, but now you're also working on disabling digital twins, if I'm correct. So, yes. We have several participants online, but also here present in the room, so it's a hybrid format. Just some ground rules for the online participants. I ask to mute yourself during the presentation. We are recording the webinar. It will be put on. We will put it on our YouTube channel afterwards. There will be some time, sufficient time for questions and discussion. So those online can already provide their questions in the chat, and those here present can also ask their questions afterwards. For the participants online, I also ask to please also include your name and affiliation so we know who's asking the questions, so we have that background, and please also engage respectfully. So then I will now give the mic to my colleague, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me, and as well for joining online. I'm very excited to talk with you about this new project I've been working on relating to digital twins. I was thinking for a while about like what to call this sort of this talk or this seminar, this discussion. Basically, I felt that it was, I wanted to call it Disabling Digital Twins, but it really, what I'm trying to explain to you all is that digital twins really has a need for disability bioethics and considerations about disability when designing and implementing digital twins. Right, so one of the first things, though, I want to clarify is, of course, like what is a digital twin, right? So oftentimes when I talk to people about digital twins, they immediately reach for sci-fi. Right? It's kind of a point of reference that people often like to go for. They often think about something like, say, an android or a robot, or something like, say, Jeff Bridges' character in the movie Tron, where he gets trapped inside this digital space called the grid, and he makes a digital duplicate of himself, and the digital duplicate of himself is evil, you know, and they get trapped in this grid thing. It's a whole thing. Right, but it's a fun movie, and I highly recommend you watch it. But the thing is that this is not really what digital twins are, obviously. What they really are is more like this. Digital twins are visual representations or virtual representations, simulations, predictive models of a physical object, system, process, and accurately represents their real-world counterpart, right? So this technology allows for the simulation of behaviors and conditions, enabling users to better understand how the physical entity operates in real life, right? So digital twins are often linked to real-time data sources. So this includes maybe, for instance, like your Apple Watch or Fitbits, your smartphone, something like this. Or for physical objects, it might be sensors of some kind. Which means that they can ultimately update dynamically based on changes within the physical environment too, right? Sometimes these things will often go by other names, like digital simulacra, digital doppelgangers. Sometimes they're conflated with these ideas of like digital shadows, which means like if you move, then it moves kind of like your shadow does, you know. NASA was also one of the first to develop this kind of technology as well, for modeling engines, for modeling parts of spacecraft. So it has its origins in industry and in aerospace. And indeed, some more advanced versions of digital twins are found in industry. So they have their roots in industry and in things like simulating large factories, large and complex machines. So here you see an example of a digital twin of a factory for Ford Motors. They can even simulate entire countries, albeit something like Singapore. I'll point out, though, that something like this digital twin of Singapore, which was originally called Virtual Singapore, is a bit more than just like another kind of Google Earth, where if you think like, oh, well, this must be like Google Earth, basically, but it's more advanced than this. Because it's much more accurate. It's constantly updated. Remember, it's dynamically updating. It includes environmental factors that aren't found in Google Earth. It also includes mapping of the city's subsurface and underground utilities. So the hope is that in developing this kind of tech for Singapore, that it'll be more efficient and more sustainable going forward. And I'm really kind of oversimplifying what digital twins are for you all, because the number of different kinds or classifications of digital twins are somewhere in the hundreds, like 200. Some folks have said there's sort of 210 different kinds of digital twins, depending on things like, say, the hierarchical levels, like are you just taking in information, or are you simulating a component, a product, a system, a multi-system? What are you using them for? Are you using them to digitize, to visualize, to simulate, right, to predict? Thinking about the life cycles as well of a product or of a system, the design, the build, operation, optimizing, maintaining, and so on and so forth. So with all these different combinations together, you have different sort of kinds of digital twins that you can make. So what is then a digital twin in the medical context, right? Well, digital twins are still these sophisticated virtual models, but of individual patients and connected in real time to simulate and predict health outcomes using personalized medical data. So it's a form of personalized and even predictive medicine. They're dynamically evolving models of physical systems of the patient, right? They leverage all kinds of data as well. They leverage genetic information, medical histories, the real-time physiological measurements to provide this really kind of comprehensive picture of a patient's health status, right? And these are, in fact, a form of AI and machine learning models with further potentials for providing predictive outcomes for patients. And again, much like I said before in terms of you can model minute parts in industry with digital twins. You can model very minute aspects at the molecular level with digital twins. So here is just an example from a paper looking at the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 and simulating the dynamics of the spike protein for COVID, right? So it's looking at, well, how does the spike protein bend and dynamically move, so that way you can better target something like this protein. Some of the more common ones also are for organs, such as kinds that you see here for heart and lung. So again, going back to COVID, for the lung digital twin, this lung is simulating a specific patient who had COVID. So it's sort of simulating how the lung is breathing and also giving some predictive components with it too, right? The heart digital twin is also quite high fidelity, so you can have digital twins of different fidelities. So you can make them very, very detailed, like this particular heart model, or you can have them very rough in terms of the kinds of, and this will depend on the kind of computing power that you might have available to run the simulation, right? Now, I should note, though, that a lot of these digital twins are still in development, and a lot of this technology is still in development and emerging. And because it's AI and machine learning technology, it requires a lot of power and energy. It requires a lot of computing power too. So the heart digital twin that you saw before required a supercomputer in order to generate it. And specifically, it required the Mare Nostrum supercomputer in Spain to generate this, this heart. So the feasibility of this stuff is still kind of in question, but nevertheless, we're sort of assuming here that their development is possible as advances in AI and in machine learning and in computer technology continue along. We can also do virtual brain twins for not just neurophysiological components of the brain, but also for psychiatric disorders, so modeling psychiatric disorders in the brain as well. There's a lot of funding that's going into something like this too. This is a recent project that was greenlit by the European Union for 10 million euros to look into modeling psychiatric disorders for specifically, I think it's for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So why make a digital twin? I've sort of alluded to some of the reasons why before, but the hope is that they can be really good in precision and predictive medicine, right? So we can construct basically a kind of unlimited copies of digital twins in a patient and then run through simulation after simulation and evaluation of different treatments for a specific disease, and then based on those outcomes, we can give the best and most efficient drug or treatment to that patient, right? So there's that aspect of the of digital twins. But in theory, all stages of the disease life cycle can be supported by digital twins. So you can do, with pre-disease management, you can do screening and prevention with them. For disease management, you can do diagnosis with a digital twin, treatment, alleviation. Of course, you can do monitoring throughout. You can give a kind of prognosis and also prediction about how the disease may develop over time. You can do them at various kinds of levels, of course. You can do an organ-level digital twin. In the future, we could do a body-level digital twin and potentially a mind-level digital twin where it is simulating your psyche or simulating your mind. And of course, not just in these stages, but there's all different kinds of areas of health that they could be applied for. But I want to shift the focus a little bit now to disability, right? I'm not just here to talk to you about the ethics of digital twins, although the ethics of digital twins on its own has, of course, some, I think, obvious ethical issues at work that's quite similar to AI, security issues, privacy issues, the black box conundrum, and so on. Those problems are still there, but when thinking about creating a digital twin for somebody with a disability, I think there's some interesting and unique contexts that are missing, right? And what's also interesting is that after kind of a quick survey of the bioethical literature, there's really nothing about disability and digital twins to really be found, right? Now, it could be the case that because digital twins are so relatively new, an emerging technology in medicine, that the bioethics literature just hasn't had a chance to catch up to it. But there is still enough literature within digital twins for bioethics to be discussing aspects of this. Or there might also be a conflation between things like disability and disease and disorder. And the idea is that, well, when we're really talking about disability, we're really talking about disease and we're really talking about disorder, and there's a conflation that's going on. So I'd like to use an example for us to think about as we go through this talk. This is an example that comes to us from Cambridge, a technology group from Cambridge that worked closely with an eye hospital there. And the idea was they wanted to integrate a transport digital twin, a patient digital twin, and a building digital twin all in one app, right? So I'll just read this to you as we go, just to give you an idea. So an app helps Suhani to navigate and get to where she wants to go. It gets dynamic or live data from the connected digital twins, giving her a seamless experience and up-to-date information even as the conditions around her change. So Suhani navigates from her home to her appointment at the eye hospital using an accessible smartphone app, which is connected to the train digital twin. The live data lets Suhani know that her usual exit from King's Cross is out of service, and the app guides her through an alternative exit that she's not familiar with. Now, the hospital has access to her patient digital twin, it's all in one app, which shows that Suhani has macular degeneration, and integrated with the hospital building's building digital twin, the app knows to lead Suhani to a step-free entrance and directs her to the third floor reception, bypassing the ground floor reception. The hospital has access to Suhani's medical data in her patient digital twin and recognizes that a scan is required before seeing the clinician. Linking with the hospital's building digital twin, the app leads her to an automated scanning station, providing her with verbal instructions. The scan is automatically run through an AI diagnostic system and attached to her patient digital twin for the clinician to refer to. But a conundrum. There's been a delay in the appointment time, as is always the case with the NHS nowadays, and a change of room, right? The app linked to the building digital twin notifies Suhani, and with its help, she navigates to the hospital canteen and toilet to get refreshed before heading to the new location. So now, after the appointment, Suhani needs to find the pharmacy post-appointment. However, she forgets the verbal instructions given to her on the way and becomes lost inside the hospital. Using the app, she signals for assistance, and the staff member finds her and via the app's link to the building digital twin. Her medicine is already waiting for her at the pharmacy, as her patient digital twin is linked to the hospital's patient administrative system. Now Suhani is ready to go home. And on the way, the transport digital twin shows two extremely crowded trains arriving at King's Cross. The app recognizes this and provides a dynamic routing to Suhani and to avoid the crowds and the possible collision hazards, right? And so basically, this is how the story ends with Suhani in this example, right? Now, just to think about this, I'd like for you to keep that story in mind as I walk through some basic aspects about disability, right? One thing is a model of disability, and disability model is different from, like, say, a digital model or something like this. It's a conceptual understanding of the origins, demarcations, and nature of disability, right? And there's usually sort of two classic models that are often discussed, which is the medical model. And under this model, disability is internal. It originates internally. It's a problem of the person's physical or mental self. And it is a state that deserves medical attention or curative treatment whenever possible. And this is usually in contrast with the social model of disability, where disability originates externally. It acknowledges things like impairment and biological conditions, but the disability results in a kind of mismatch between the impairment and the external environment, right? So it's resulting really from social, attitudinal, and environmental barriers. And the solutions for disability in this case are more about barrier removal rather than impairment improvement, right? There are other models of disability out there, of course. There's the biopsychosocial model that the WHO uses. There's the capabilities approach. Recently, I've been diving into the ecological and active model of disability as well, and thinking about it in this sort of context. But I won't belabor that point, right? But if we think about a little bit before moving on, if we think about the model of disability here for Suhani in that last example, in some cases, I think the example tried to get a little bit beyond the medical model and focused a little bit more on how Suhani interacts with her environment. But nevertheless, notice where she was going. It was to the eye hospital, as if Suhani maybe doesn't want to go on a night out somewhere, right? And it's all integrated together into one, right? But at the same time, there wasn't so much barrier removal in the example, right? There were still like the steps in the front entrance of the hospital, and the app had to navigate her around that environment, rather than the solution from, say, the social model is to, say, build a hospital that doesn't have steps, which might be really important, especially if it's an eye hospital, you know? But, hey. So, what's interesting, too, is that digital twins in healthcare could also shift the way we also think about normality and abnormality by focusing on these highly detailed and individualized models that are capturing unique individual health patterns, right? So this approach is in contrast with a sort of traditional population-based or biological statistical mean conception of normality, where what is normal is closer to the mean of something, right? Now it's maybe the case that it might shift the idea of what is normal to what is normal for you as an individual, which could be a good thing, but nevertheless, it's a potential shift, right? However, this reconceptualization of normality also carries the risk of reinforcing some ableist notions of normalcy by establishing some detailed benchmarks for individual health. Digital twins may also inadvertently promote a very narrow view of health that promotes certain physical and cognitive abilities within the individual. And this could lead to some marginalization of individuals whose health profiles do not conform to these technologically defined norms, right? And perpetuating various ableist attitudes. Some scholars have pointed out that the enhanced ability to pinpoint deviations from the norm might lead to a heightened focus on what is considered abnormal, too. Potentially pathologizing what are really natural variations within health and inability, right? So this increased scrutiny could then exacerbate social pressures to conform to this idealized health standard, and further entrenching ableist biases by emphasizing correction or enhancement of perceived deficiencies. And moreover, predictive capabilities of digital twins also introduce some new dimensions of normality too, where future health outcomes are anticipated and potentially pathologized before they even manifest. So this could pressure individuals to conform to predicted health trajectories and reinforcing certain social expectations about normalcy. So for instance, if we had a cognitive digital twin where we could predict whether or not you might develop psychopathy, there might be some questions, of course, about what to do in this case, even though you are not currently in your present state a psychopath, and you might thus carry a stigma of a potential future self that is not yet realized, right? There's also potentially some concerns about what Ashley Hsu calls techno-ableism. And she says techno-ableism is a belief in the power of technology that considers the elimination of disability a good thing and something we should strive for. So quite similar to some of the prescriptions of, say, the medical model. It uses technology to reassert those biases, often under the guise of empowerment. So something like, say, for the example with Suhani, one could argue that, well, this digital twin app was really empowering Suhani, right, in order to make her be independent and go and get on the train and go to the eye hospital, go through her appointment on her own, and then go back home on her own as well, right? But at the same time, probably Suhani, before the introduction of that digital twin, could probably already do that sort of thing. And it's sort of like saying, well, you know, Suhani, you really need more help in order to navigate the world, when she probably could have been just fine with her cane, right? There's also this idea within techno-ableism, too, that disabled people could be seen as sort of beta testers for a technology. So are disabled people being used as beta testers for some emerging tech? So early digital twin testers for, say, enhancement purposes, for example, right? Ashley Hsu also gives this example relating to exoskeletons, where people who are paraplegic try on these exoskeletons in order to get them to walk around. But of course, one of the downsides with something like this, and again, it doesn't really think about the way people with disabilities navigate the world. One of the interesting things about this is that how do you actually go to the bathroom in something like an exoskeleton? It's a very basic human function, and yet it's not really given any sort of consideration. And a lot of times the funding for something like these exoskeletons is often done by the military, so that they could use for military purposes. And the military also invests quite heavily in digital twins. And so there's a concern that, say, disabled users of digital twins are actually beta testing for other, say, defensive purposes, for the state, or for corporate interests, right? But another important point I'd like for us to consider, too, is the different ways disability can also be embodied, right? So let's consider leg amputees for a moment, right? If you have a leg amputation, you have multiple ways in which you can maneuver through your environment. You can use a prosthetic, you can use a crutch, you can use a wheelchair, you can use potentially other forms of modality, right, to move. Each of these ways is a different form of embodying the leg amputation, right? And you, as a leg amputee, are free to choose one of these as a primary form of your embodiment to move, or move from another to another form as you want, right? Some amputees like their prosthetics on some days. Sometimes they prefer a wheelchair. Sometimes they prefer the crutch. And you are free to move about in either way. Now, the question for digital twin becomes, how should it handle these different possibilities, right? Should a digital twin give a preference to one form or another, or nudge, in a way, the amputee to go towards one or another, right? And on what basis, right? Should we create 3 or more separate digital twins for each possible embodiment? And I'd like for you all to know, too, most likely, as is sometimes is the case, insurance will often only pay for one of these modes, and you have to pay out of pocket for, say, other modes of embodiment, right? So again, if insurance is involved with something like a digital twin, they might say, well, your digital twin says that you will have greater mobility, however that may be defined, via having a prosthetic, when you might say, no, I don't want a prosthetic, I want to get around on crutches. Or I want to use a wheelchair instead. There's also some questions about disability identity too, right? So disability identity refers to how individuals perceive and define themselves in relation to their disabilities. It encompasses things like social, cultural, and personal aspects of living with a disability. This can be shaped by various factors, which includes things like social attitudes and personal experiences. There's, of course, other things like an intersectionality of these identities with other kinds of identities like race, gender, and socioeconomic class, and things like this. But I'd like for us to also consider how, say, digital twins might affect things like, say, communal attachment for our identities, feeling connected to a community of others with similar experiences, right? Not everyone's going to have the experience of a digital twin. There's also the affirmation of disability that's also part of disability identity, which is embracing one's disability as a positive aspect of their lives, whereas it's not inherently clear that digital twins are going to enhance the positive aspects of disability, right? There's also things like self-worth and pride, and what I would also think of as dignity, or a dimension of dignity in a way, developing a sense of pride in one's identity and one's abilities. There's, of course, discrimination, where disability identity or various forms of it are a way of navigating and resisting various social discriminations and stigmas. Of course, there's also personal meaning, which is finding personal significance and meaning in one's own disability too. And again, it's not clear how digital twins will affect these aspects of identity one way or another. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just kind of jump ahead a little bit, but choosing disability is an interesting idea here too. But disability narrative, I think, is also an important part as with things like emerging technologies. I'd like for us to consider, for instance, how narratives function. And narratives function at different levels, right? We have personal narratives, we have interpersonal narratives, we have these sort of subcultural narratives, and sort of at the very tippy top level, we have master narratives. And these refer to a kind of a dominant and widely accepted version of events or stories that shape and influences people's understanding and perception about reality, right? It often serves as a framework through which individuals interpret their experiences in the world. And Jackie Leach Scully identifies various master disability narratives that run through society, like the tragic victim, hero overcoming the odds, or what's known as a super crip, the saintly sage, the sweet angel, the comic, the contaminants, the burden to society and family, and the evil or obsessive avenger, psychologically or morally warped by an impairment, right? Now again, thinking back to the example with Suhani, you could probably identify certain elements of these master narratives within it, right? And another quote from Scully here I think is really interesting relating to the master narratives. Master narratives of disability, created in the main by non-disabled people, persist because of the comfort they offer. They contain the anxiety that non-disabled and often disabled people too have about disability, right? So our digital twins, say like in the example that was presented with Suhani, presented in ways that maintain existing master narratives of disability, and how best should they actually be presented? So I'll switch gears really quickly for thinking about disability rights as well. And there's a question, of course, how does AI play within human rights? But I think disability rights has its own sort of caveats that ought to be considered too. So there are things like accessibility rights, right, where individuals with disabilities have the right to access public spaces, including buildings, transportation, and services. This includes requirements for ramps, elevators, accessible restrooms to ensure everyone can navigate their environment safely and independently. But again, some proponents of digital twins might look at the example with Suhani and say, what are you talking about? Like, of course we're enhancing her accessibility by giving her this other tool, right? But accessibility rights are not really about, oh, we're giving you another tool to navigate the world. It's more about creating a world or creating an environment that is accessible to everyone inherently, right? There are things like employment rights as well relating to disability, where under laws like, say, the Americans with Disabilities Act, individuals with disabilities are entitled to equal employment opportunities, and employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations to enable employees with disabilities to perform their jobs effectively. Now, I can't help but wonder if, say, like for example, with like we had with Suhani, if a corporation or if a business had a copy of a digital twin that is perhaps similar or exactly like Suhani and does an analysis and simulations and says, well, based on the simulation, we can't really hire you, Suhani, I'm sorry, right? Because the simulation says that you can't do the job, right? Now, is that a violation of something like the Americans with Disabilities Act? Now, I'm not a legal scholar, but I think one could make the case that it very well could be, because it's talking about what she can and cannot do, not in a present context, but in a modal context, right? There's also things like social services and support. People with disabilities are entitled to access social services and support systems that assist them in living independently and participating fully in their communities. And so this includes access to personal assistive services, transportation, and community programs. So again, can digital twins help with these rights, or are they detracting from them potentially, right? And of course, healthcare rights. This is a medical context after all. Individuals with disabilities also have the right to receive healthcare services without discrimination, and this includes access to medical faculties, treatments, and necessary support services that accommodate their specific health needs. Right, so is there any guarantee that there won't be forms of discrimination on this sort of basis with digital twins? And I would argue no. In fact, depending on how digital twins are governed and maintained, it could be the case that we sort of revert to a model where, well, your digital twin says that you have this sort of condition, and thus you cannot access this form of healthcare, but you can access this other form of healthcare. Why? Because maybe health insurance says that it's cheaper for you to do so, right? For that reason. There's other issues, of course, and I won't belabor them here because I think we need some time for discussion. There's questions, of course, about consent, which forms of consent, which digital twins do we need to think about for different forms of consent, and for whom specifically. Of course, there's a question about autonomy as well. Like, do digital twins truly enhance the autonomy of an individual with a disability? And what is the distinction between something like enhancing autonomy versus something like independence and self-determination? There's, of course, privacy issues. Can privacy be guaranteed? Is privacy even desirable in a kind of medical context here, too? After all, thinking about the Suhani example, there might be some questions about privacy, right? Because there's an integration of all these different kinds of digital twins all together in one app. But is that really a bad thing? Is that desirable? Also, is it even possible, right, in some cases, to truly guarantee privacy, right? Consider, for instance, really extremely rare conditions and e-health records, right? So what are the possible ways forward with this? Well, how do we ensure that digital twins and disability mix together sort of in the right and moral way? Well, in many ways, what I suggest is sort of nothing new. Much of this also comes from work previously with Professor Dierks. First and foremost, I'd like for us to consider this disability slogan, "Nothing about us without us," right? It's not just a slogan, it's a call for inclusion, and I would argue that people with disabilities ought to be co-creators of digital twins, not merely the subject of what is being duplicated and digitized, right? Continue reconsidering these distinctions between disability, illness, behavior, and person. So thinking about other models of disability beyond the medical and social models, because both of those also have their own drawbacks. And so it might be good for us to continuously reconsider these ideas. And I think there's also an important aspect with digital twins too, that deals with appropriate and practical communication about, with, and from digital twins, right? Because digital twins have an interface with them. And so there's a communication aspect that needs to be considered, right? How do people with disabilities interact with the digital twin and communicate with the digital twin is also an important dimension here. How do clinicians who work with digital twins communicate about them, right? And how do digital twins, if they are communicating prognosis and predictions, what is the most ethical way in which they communicate these things to people, right? Because there's a tact of how you deliver bad news, right, to somebody. And if digital twins don't have that tact, there's a question of like, are they going to do some harm here, right? So I think these are kind of general three good ways to begin thinking about integrating disability into the discussion and ethics surrounding digital twins. So thank you very much, and I look forward to chatting with you. So maybe while you're, oh, okay. Potentially it's working. Hey-oh.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew, for that very nice and clear presentation. Are there any questions in the room? I'm gonna come with the mic for the recording also, Camille. If there are any questions online, please put them in the chat already. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting topic. I was wondering a little bit, I think it was last year that there was a call for an embargo on, then it was AI and AI development. And I was wondering whether something similar would be applicable here, specifically for giving the time for a certain disability community to reflect on their stance on digital twins being developed for them before these things get developed, because out of the fear that if you immediately start co-creating, maybe they don't have their own reflections on the topic yet, and they might, through epistemic injustice mechanisms, get into the narrative or the dominant narrative there. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's an interesting one because, of course, those calls for the embargo of AI would inherently include digital twins, because digital twins are a form of AI and machine learning and deep learning. They require a lot of neural networks to function. So all of that would, those calls for an embargo would, of course, inherently apply here. I don't know if I fully agree with the embargo, mostly because I don't think all forms of AI in medicine would be a terribly awful idea. There's the classic example of certain kinds of AI, not like, say, generative AI, but certain forms of AI that are useful in, say, like looking at protein folding. That's like a classic example of like sorting through millions of combinations of protein foldings to see which is a possible form, right? I think that the problem with this and saying like, well, we have to have an embargo for digital twins and disability is because it's problematic because there's still this conflation between disease and disability. So oftentimes if we were to call for an embargo for you can't use AI or digital twins for disability, what clinicians might hear is, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I'm trying to help somebody who has a heart condition, right? So that's probably the big issue here with like saying calling for an embargo in that manner, and at least until like there's a genuine and better way of and perhaps an agreed upon way of thinking about what a disability is, as opposed to an impairment or a condition or a disease, right? So that's probably the main thing that I would worry about with it. I'd rather that instead of calling for an embargo, that we immediately go towards more like a co-creative model where we bring people with disabilities into the fold, into the creative design process, or into, like, say, the aims, thinking about what the aims of digital twins ought to be for. I think that would be a better way of doing it, and we can kind of do more of a building the airplane as we fly it sort of manner, which is often done in science anyway.
So more including them on a project level or a study level rather
Yes.
than very general. Oh, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew, for your very inspiring talk. You said that, let's say, based on your review of the literature, there is no literature yet about the link between disability and digital twins. My question is, looking at, let's say, upcoming practices, do you have any indication of the, let's say, narrative that is being used by very embryonic forms of digital twins with regard to disabilities on the one hand? And my second question is, who is responsible to, let's say, guide these developments in the right direction?
Both really good questions. So I think first, there's not much talk really either within the ethical literature, or even from what I've seen on about the technical literature for digital twins relating to embryos or fetuses, or digital twins of embryos and fetuses. I imagine that is something that folks will probably in the future, kind of gravitate toward. And of course, the big issue there is the question of the predictive modeling of these embryos. And I imagine there will be questions like how this relates to something like in vitro fertilization and selective embryonic implantation and things like this. But as far as I see, I haven't seen much in either aspects relating to it. But I can also imagine that there are researchers who will eventually move toward it, right? The other thing, a question of, like, say, who's responsible, I do think ethicists, of course, play a role in this, in guiding the conversation. But I also think in the same way, there are disability advocates who do their best to try and insert themselves into the conversation, and they take up the responsibility themselves because they often see, well, nobody's going to advocate for me, right? So oftentimes some of the best advocates or some of the best folks to think about this stuff are folks within the various disability communities. So I think, but at the same time, it's also a little bit unfair to demand that, hey, disability community, you need to understand this technology, you need to be the advocates, and you need to be the ones that pick up the slack for it, right? Although I think there's a role and they ought to be, in a way, leading the charge. But at the same time, I think ethicists play a role. I think, of course, the developers of the technology should play a role in at least trying to understand or be aware of the inherent biases and inherent issues or the missing context that they are forgetting about. So there's a bunch of different folks who play these different roles, and I hope that everyone can sort of come together and talk about it.
Okay, we also have a question from Ina de Vos from the University of Antwerp, who's following online. She says, hi Andrew, would you be able to give an example of how these master narratives are at play in your example case of Suhani? How do you think this influences the digital twins and their use in this case?
Yeah, so with the example of Suhani, I think that there are elements of these different master narratives. Let me run back for other folks who aren't interested in looking at it. Whoops. There we go. So I think in a way there is a kind of hero overcoming the odds in some sense of this. Although Suhani is not actively being portrayed as a hero, in some ways, she is being presented as this character of overcoming the odds of navigating the environment around her. How is she doing it? She's doing it with this technology, right? In some ways, the example is more of a selling pitch. It's more of a commercial, if you will, for something like, hey, look at this technology and how awesome and useful it is, right? So I think that there's part of that that's in there. I don't think, of course, she's being portrayed as, like, say, a tragic victim or anything like this, although I think she is inadvertently sort of being shown as, like, you know, sort of imagine what she would be like if she didn't have this technology. Imagine how hard her life would be without it, right? So I think there are different elements of this that are wrapped up within it. How would, say, I think there'll be a kind of interplay for the second part of the question. There'll be an interplay between the digital twins and the master narrative and the master narrative and the digital twin. So I think digital twins, depending on how the stories with the digital twins are told, they might encompass or might inherently embody, like, these kinds of master narratives about disability, but you can also think about it beforehand and say, wait a minute, what kind of stories are we going to tell with digital twins? And then use a different master narrative to tell the story with the digital twin. Maybe that the digital twins, because of their design and the way they might be implemented, they might lend themselves perhaps towards certain master narratives than others. I'm no literary scholar, but I imagine that could also be the case. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this terrific talk. I'm Silvia Camporesi. I think I'm really interested in the discussion on disability and prosthetics, of course, also as it relates to sport. And I think you rightly pointed out that people with disability also could be, have the potential to be exploited as beta testers for all kind of new technologies which does not take into account their needs or how they function into the world. I mean, this kind of discussion would be interesting also to look at them through the lens of things that were happening for patients with, can't think of, I think the technical term is phocomelia, that people were born without following thalidomide, the drug that during pregnancies was causing teratogenic effects, and there were other discussion about exoskeletons or kind of prosthesis, but these people function in the world often without the need for a technological addendum. And there was an example of a scholar in the US, an American scholar, who was born with shortened upper limbs. Now I can't think of her name, but that she is also a disability scholar activist, and she put forward the Rosamund Garland Thompson, or Rosemary Garland Thompson,
Yeah.
the idea of misfit. So that basically the portrayal of that she needed assistant portrayed also people like her with short-term upper limbs as a misfit into the world, but actually she was able to function. And this is just an example, so maybe also looking back at some of those discussion for the disabling twins could be interesting. And another thought that I have was in relation to the Cybathlon. So recently, I don't know if people, or you know what the Cybathlon is. The Cybathlon is this event that took place in Zurich just last week for the second time, where it's a competition event which involves pilots. Pilots are people with disability and technical teams. And they are tested on 6 different competition events. One is brain-computer interfaces, one is exoskeletons, one is prosthesis for upper limb or lower limbs, and they need to do tasks. But I haven't had a close look, but I think possibly much of that is also informed by the medical model. And this is really a combination of technical teams of bioengineers working with people with disability who are called pilots, who are tested in a competitive environment. And it just happened. I was like following a little bit, but not too closely. But I think that probably if you look at that, you will already see many things that could through your lens, which is very, very original. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. A lot of the stuff now, the emerging tech field with medicine also and disability kind of intersects with those other areas, like within sport, for instance. I know, for instance, there are digital twins being used or developed for sport purposes. And there's questions about, say, oh, well, we can bring in athletes and assess the athletes' digital twins. And based on those digital twins, we can try and say, get the best out of these athletes, and sort of, in a way, sort of push athletes as far as they can go. And I can't help but wonder, like, for the techno-ableism idea with Ashley Hsu, if the technology for digital twins that's being developed, maybe for patients or for folks with disabilities, is then going to potentially be turned around and be sold to, say, professional organizations, and in order to enhance professional athletes, and try and get the best out of their abilities in that way. And so, like, the benefits of this are sort of like moving from, say, folks with disabilities who, let's face it, they often have a low socioeconomic standing and may not be able to afford continuous digital twin monitoring. But maybe a professional organization like a professional athletic organization could, right? So, yeah, I think I can kind of see, like, of course, the interplay between digital twins and disability and something like sport, and various other contexts of kinds of technology outside of it. So, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Andrew. I think we have to wrap up because the room is booked at 1. But thank you all for joining. I just want to remind you quickly that we have one last seminar this year on the 2nd of December. It will also be hybrid by our colleague Lara Andreoli, who will be talking about ethical and societal issues with regard to polygenic risk scores in use in the clinic. So thank you all for joining, also for the people online, and I will make the recording available as soon as possible. Thank you so much.